I reckon you could make a drinking game out of those types of games that get released on Steam. You know, every time you hear the word roguelike, pixel art, procedurally generated or old school, take a shot of Jack Daniels. Even if you space this drinking game out across a whole year, I think you'd be perpetually drunk. One More Dungeon is one of those types of games. Combining all of these buzzwords into one package, it's a first-person dungeon crawler where you move through 10 randomly generated levels. Developed by a team called Stately Snail, it's now available for Microsoft Windows. The game runs on the Unity engine, which doesn't really matter as the game intentionally aims for adequate visuals, which is true for both the sound and music as well. The gameplay is a combination of utilising ranged and melee weapons, melee being something like a sword or an axe held in the right hand and assigned to the right mouse button, and ranged weapons in the form of magical staffs, wielded in the left and expectedly used with the left mouse button. Each new game gives you the option to choose from a bunch of mutators which modify some game parameters, all of these unlocked through currency you earn in the game. So right off the bat you'll notice that this game has some pretty big hit detection issues, with your staff projectiles often just going right through an enemy, and with the melee weapons having such a pathetic range that you'll most likely not even use them at all. You don't have a crosshair and the melee weapons don't actually hit the center of the screen, more so it's like the bottom right side of the screen, just making the melee inherently broken and an absolute chore. I seriously cannot emphasize how bad this actually is, it really does just make the game unbearable at times. I found the only melee weapon that had any use to me whatsoever was the spear, which at least had enough range that enemies weren't within striking distance when I was trying to use it, but it doesn't change the fact that this is just a broken, horrible system. Staffs are broken up into 3 elements, primarily acid, fire and ice, with crystals serving as ammo for each type. I guess the idea here is that each element does different damage against certain enemy types, but you really just have to use what you're given, as running out of crystals is common, especially in the earlier levels. As you get further in the game, you get upgraded staffs, which use more crystals but obviously deal out more damage, and this carries across to the melee weapons as well. Every enemy in the game pretty much just gets right up in your face and attacks you with either a melee or ranged attack. From snails to spiders, bats, vampires, and floating skulls, they all function mostly the same, and all you really need is a plentiful crystal supply so you can keep firing until they stop coming. If you don't have the right staff for the right crystal type, then you're kinda screwed. And in a new playthrough, you can sometimes go 2, 3, or even 4 floors with only one kind of staff. One cool idea the game has is the idea of a sanity meter. Throughout the game, you find these demonic artifacts that use up your mind points. The lower this gets, the higher chance you have of being invaded, I guess, by demons that spawn in. You come across some spooky looking portals in the game that send you to these alternate dimensions where you find some of the better looking artifacts, and some of them can make or break a playthrough. The problem is that One More Dungeon just suffers from a bunch of straight out debilitating issues that kill the fun factor totally. As is the case with all of these roguelike, procedurally generated games, you're literally at the mercy of an invisible number crunching system that is deciding what types of enemies you face, what type of items you get, and just how difficult the game is in general. Sometimes you'll get an abundance of crystals and weapons from the get-go, but other times you'll die not because of lack of skill, but just because you're so bone dry on resources. Sure, it doesn't help that everything in this game kills you so damn quickly. I mean, even the fucking rats can kill you in a matter of seconds. But what is the real nail in the coffin is just the inconsistent allocation of items and weapons. It's always funny how these types of games always proclaim how they're taking influence from old school FPS games. You know, those very same old school FPS games when an actual level designer would sit down and spend hours and hours putting items and enemies into specific places, instead of just creating an algorithm that did the job for him. On that note, I also take umbrage with how so many modern indie developers misconstrue the old school pixel art. Go look at a game like Hexen, for instance, which is a great example of an old school game, and just look at the amount of detail they've tried to cram into the art style. I've noticed that modern developers think that settling for simplicity is a good thing, when if anything, they should be trying to utilize the modern gaming engines to cram as much detail as possible into their games. Settling on such basic looking pixel art as if it's trying to encapsulate old school gaming is just laziness. One More Dungeon reminds me of another similar game I played called Delver, which takes what One More Dungeon has tried to do and does it a lot better. Now look, I don't want to derail the video, and if you're thinking of picking this game up, then don't let me stop you, but there are alternatives if this one doesn't quite fully scratch the itch. This is quite simply just not a well-rounded game, but I guess the real underlying factor is that it just isn't any fun. It doesn't have an original bone in its body, and everything that it tries to do has been done better multiple times. One more dungeon is just one more forgettable game that you don't need to waste your time with.